Fight back, little girl. The words hung in the air with a confidence that only someone who had spent a lifetime believing fear was the strongest currency could possess. Every conversation inside the Harbor Crown Lounge seemed to vanish at once. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. The jazz pianist hesitated for a single note before quietly finding the melody again. Even the rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago sounded softer, as though the city itself wanted to witness what would happen next. Vincent Moretti stood near the polished walnut bar with the calm smile of a man who had never expected anyone to refuse him. Expensive suit, silver watch, perfect posture. People across the city whispered his name in private, but rarely dared to say it aloud in public. Influence followed him into every room like a second shadow. Employees straightened their uniforms when he entered. Business owners suddenly remembered appointments. Strangers looked away before their eyes could accidentally meet his. Tonight was supposed to be another ordinary evening where everyone quietly agreed that Vincent Moretti always got what he wanted. Naomi Brooks had no interest in becoming part of his story. At 28, she had worked enough late shifts to recognize trouble long before it reached her section. She carried drinks with steady hands, greeted every guest with the same respectful smile, and believed the easiest argument to win was the one that never began. Most customers remembered the expensive bourbon, the skyline view, or the famous desserts. Very few remembered the waitress who quietly made their evening feel effortless. Naomi preferred it that way. Invisible people noticed everything. She noticed which couples were celebrating anniversaries, which executives secretly hated each other despite their polished handshakes, which lonely regular always ordered 2 glasses of wine, although no one ever joined him. She also noticed fear. Fear had a look, tight shoulders, forced laughter, eyes searching for exits without moving their heads. Tonight that look spread across the lounge one table at a time as Vincent's entourage arrived. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody complained when reservations suddenly disappeared. Nobody questioned why security guards positioned themselves near every entrance. Naomi simply continued her work, placing a fresh glass of sparkling water on the counter with the same quiet professionalism she offered every guest. She had learned years ago that dignity was not something another person could hand you. It was something you carried yourself, especially on the nights when the world tried to convince you otherwise. Then one careless movement changed the rhythm of the room. A leather briefcase slid from a crowded stool after another customer reached for his coat. Naomi reacted on instinct, stepping forward before it struck the polished floor. The case landed safely in her hands. No documents scattered. No expensive electronics were damaged. She expected a simple thank you. Instead, Vincent slowly turned toward her with an expression that suggested she had crossed an invisible line no one else could see. He stepped closer, close enough for every nearby guest to stop pretending they were not listening. His smile widened, patient and cold. "Fight back, little girl," he repeated, almost amused by the silence surrounding them. Naomi met his eyes for only a moment before calmly setting the briefcase on the counter. She neither apologized nor argued. She simply stood there, breathing steadily, while dozens of strangers waited to see whether fear or grace would speak first. None of them could have imagined that the quiet woman standing behind the bar had spent the past 15 years mastering a discipline built not on anger, but on control, restraint, and the unwavering decision to protect dignity before pride. The silence inside the Harbor Crown Lounge lasted only a few seconds, but for Naomi Brooks it stretched across 15 years of memories. Long before designer suits, polished marble floors, and breathtaking views of the Chicago skyline became part of her nightly routine, she had learned that the loudest people were rarely the strongest. She had been 13 when her father, Marcus Brooks, first placed a pair of worn training gloves on the old gym floor beneath her feet. The building was nothing glamorous. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained. The windows rattled every winter. The heavy bags carried layers of repaired canvas instead of expensive leather. But to Marcus, that modest neighborhood gym was a classroom where character mattered more than trophies. He never promised his daughter she would become the toughest person in any room. Instead, he repeated the same lesson every Saturday morning before sunrise. Control your breathing before you control your decisions. Respect people before you expect respect from them. Leave every conflict you can, Because the greatest victory is arriving home with your conscience intact. Naomi listened more than she spoke. While other teenagers chased attention on social media or worried about fitting in, she spent countless mornings practicing balance, awareness, and discipline. She learned how to remain calm while others rushed. She learned how to notice exits, broken glass, uneven floors, and frightened faces without appearing distracted. Most importantly, she learned that confidence never needed an audience. Marcus often smiled whenever students asked why his daughter rarely demonstrated techniques during community events. His answer never changed. Real strength does not perform on command. It appears only when someone else has no choice left. Years passed. College was financially impossible after Marcus developed serious health problems that forced him to retire from coaching. Medical bills arrived faster than insurance paperwork. Naomi accepted the first steady job she could find, eventually earning a position at one of Chicago's most exclusive lounges. Some friends quietly wondered why someone so intelligent remained a waitress for so long. They did not know she worked double shifts to cover rent, prescription costs, and physical therapy appointments for the man who had spent his life teaching others to stand tall. Marcus never complained about losing the gym. He simply told Naomi that life changes uniforms, but never changes purpose. Whether you wear training gloves or an apron, your character stays exactly the same. Those words became her private compass. Every difficult customer became another opportunity to practice patience instead of pride. Every careless insult became another reminder that another person's opinion could never define her value. She smiled because she chose peace, not because she accepted disrespect. Back inside the Harbor Crown Lounge, the polished room looked almost frozen beneath the warm amber lights. Waiters exchanged uncertain glances without moving from their stations. Guests lowered their voices until conversations became little more than whispers beneath the soft music drifting across the bar. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the smooth wooden counter, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. Across from her, Vincent Moretti watched with growing curiosity. Most people reacted to pressure immediately. Some apologized. Others argued. A few panicked. Naomi did none of those things. Her calm refused to fit into the story he expected. That puzzled him far more than anger ever could. He studied her face as though searching for fear hidden somewhere behind her quiet eyes. Instead, he found something unfamiliar. Patience, the kind built over thousands of ordinary mornings that no one else had ever witnessed. And somewhere deep inside that silence, the balance of the room had already begun to shift, even though almost nobody realized it yet. Vincent Moretti had spent more than 2 decades building a reputation that traveled faster than he ever needed to. People who had never met him still recognized his name. Restaurant owners rearranged private dining rooms the moment his reservation appeared. Luxury hotels quietly upgraded his suites without being asked. Security teams suddenly became more attentive whenever his black SUV pulled to the front entrance. He enjoyed that invisible influence because it saved him from raising his voice. In his experience, expectation was more powerful than intimidation. If people believed you controlled every outcome, most of them surrendered before a conversation even began. That belief had become the foundation of everything he owned. He was not born into wealth. He grew up in a crowded neighborhood on the south side of Chicago where every decision carried consequences and every opportunity seemed temporary. His father repaired delivery trucks. His mother worked overnight shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. They taught him honesty, but the streets around him rewarded something different. By the time Vincent reached adulthood, he had convinced himself that kindness belonged to dreamers while control belonged to survivors. He entered the private security business with remarkable discipline, slowly surrounding himself with ambitious men who admired confidence more than character. Successful contracts turned into influential friendships. Influential friendships became profitable investments. Expensive restaurants, exclusive clubs, and luxury real estate followed. Newspapers described him as a powerful entrepreneur. Online magazines praised his business instincts. Very few people questioned how quickly doors seemed to open whenever he arrived. Vincent welcomed the mystery. Mystery encouraged assumptions, and assumptions often worked in his favor. Yet beneath every polished interview and carefully tailored suit remained one dangerous habit. He constantly tested people. He believed every stranger carried a hidden price. Some folded under pressure. Others accepted humiliation to protect their paycheck. A few attempted to impress him with empty confidence. Those private experiments amused him because they reinforced the story he told himself every morning. Everyone breaks eventually. He had repeated that sentence so many times that it no longer sounded like an opinion. It sounded like fact. That was why Naomi unsettled him before she had spoken more than a handful of words. She did not challenge him. She did not flatter him. She did not rush to explain herself. She simply remained composed, and composure denied him the reaction he expected. Around the Harbor Crown Lounge, guests quietly returned to their tables, but nobody truly resumed dinner. Conversations drifted toward unfinished sentences before disappearing altogether. A bartender slowly polished the same glass for nearly a full minute without realizing it. A young couple celebrating an engagement exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to leave or stay. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows, reflecting across Lake Michigan like scattered stars, while soft jazz once again filled the spaces between heartbeats. Vincent rested one hand against the polished bar and studied Naomi with growing fascination rather than immediate frustration. He had encountered lawyers who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking. He had met athletes who performed before packed stadiums without showing nerves. Even seasoned executives occasionally betrayed themselves with restless hands or hurried speech. Naomi displayed none of those familiar signs. She stood with quiet confidence that seemed completely disconnected from the expensive room surrounding her. It was not pride. It was something steadier, something earned over years instead of moments. For the first time that evening, Vincent realized he could not predict what she would do next. And for a man who had built his entire life around certainty, that unexpected uncertainty felt far heavier than silence. The room tried to convince itself that everything was normal again, but normal had already left with the last honest laugh. A server quietly replaced untouched appetizers. The bartender refreshed a row of spotless glasses that did not need polishing. Somewhere near the windows, a business executive pretended to read an email while watching the reflection behind his phone. Harbor Crown Lounge had hosted celebrities, championship celebrations, and billion-dollar negotiations, yet the quiet spreading across the room felt heavier than any headline that had ever passed through its doors. Vincent Moretti seemed to notice it too. He glanced around with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to owning every conversation without asking permission. A faint smile returned to his face as one of his associates approached carrying a crystal tumbler filled with sparkling mineral water. Before the man could set it down, another member of the group turned too quickly, brushing against his shoulder. The glass slipped from uncertain fingers, struck the edge of the polished counter, and shattered across the marble floor. Tiny fragments scattered beneath the amber lights like scattered pieces of ice. The sound echoed through the lounge, sharp enough to draw every eye back toward the bar. Nobody moved. The employee nearest the broken glass hesitated, looking first at the manager, then at Vincent, unsure which direction safety required. Vincent slowly shifted his attention toward the young employee. His smile disappeared, replaced by a long silence that seemed carefully measured rather than emotional. The employee immediately lowered his head and apologized, his voice barely louder than the music floating through the room. Vincent listened without interrupting. That was often how he exercised authority. He allowed silence to become heavier than words until people filled it with their own fear. Naomi watched the exchange while reaching for a broom stored behind a service station. She walked toward the broken glass with calm, unhurried steps, careful not to disturb the guests seated nearby. Before she could kneel to clear the floor, Vincent lifted one hand. It was not an aggressive gesture. It was simply a signal to wait. Naomi stopped immediately, meeting his gaze without challenge. Around them, nobody seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Vincent tilted his head slightly, studying her expression as though she were another puzzle refusing to solve itself. "You always stay this calm?" he asked. His voice carried across the room, not because he shouted, but because everyone else had fallen completely silent. Naomi answered with the same respectful tone she had used all evening. "Calm helps people think clearly, sir." Several guests exchanged quick glances. The response contained no sarcasm, no fear, and no attempt to impress him. It was simply true. Vincent gave a quiet laugh that sounded more curious than amused. Most people rush to explain themselves, he replied. You do not seem interested in proving anything. Naomi looked briefly toward the broken glass still scattered across the marble. The floor still needs to be cleaned, she said gently. That matters more than winning an argument. The sentence lingered in the air far longer than anyone expected. An elderly couple seated near the fireplace exchanged small smiles. The bartender finally placed the polished glass back on the shelf. Even the lounge manager seemed surprised by how naturally the conversation had shifted away from confrontation. Vincent folded his arms, watching Naomi retrieve the broom and carefully clear every fragment from the floor with practiced precision. She treated the simple task with the same attention she would have given any guest in the room. Nothing about her movements suggested she was trying to make a statement. Yet every quiet action challenged something Vincent had believed for years. He had expected resistance or surrender. Instead, he found discipline. And as the last pieces of shattered glass disappeared into the collection pan, an unexpected question settled into his mind. What kind of life teaches someone to remain this steady when everyone else is waiting for them to break? Naomi emptied the collection pan into a disposal container behind the service station and returned the broom to its place as though the evening had finally settled back into routine. For a brief moment, the familiar rhythm of the Harbor Crown Lounge seemed to return. Soft jazz drifted through the room again. Candlelight shimmered across polished tables. Waiters resumed serving entrees with careful smiles that looked practiced rather than relaxed. Yet beneath the polished elegance, everyone sensed that the night had quietly crossed an invisible line. Vincent Moretti remained where he was, watching Naomi with the patient curiosity of a man who rarely encountered surprises. Most people either competed for his approval or avoided his attention altogether. Naomi had done neither. That alone made her impossible to dismiss. One of Vincent's associates leaned toward him and spoke quietly enough that only their table could hear. Vincent answered with a slight shake of his head before standing once more. He adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket and walked a few slow steps toward the center of the lounge. No one blocked his path. No one ever did. Naomi noticed him approaching while placing fresh linen napkins beside an empty table reserved for late arrivals. She greeted him with the same professional expression she offered every guest. Is there anything else I can help you with this evening, sir? Vincent studied her for another long moment before answering. You have remarkable patience. Naomi smiled politely. Hospitality teaches patience every day. No, Vincent replied. That is not what I mean. He glanced around the room, almost inviting the silent audience to pay attention. Most people have a point where composure begins to crack. I have been looking for yours. Naomi considered his words before responding. Perhaps you are looking for the wrong thing. The answer surprised several nearby guests. It was respectful, thoughtful, and impossible to mistake for disrespect. Vincent folded his hands behind his back. Then tell me, he said, what should I be looking for? Naomi looked briefly toward an older gentleman seated alone near the window. The man had quietly dropped his reading glasses beside his chair without noticing. She walked over, picked them up carefully, and returned them with a warm smile before coming back. Only then did she answer Vincent's question. You learn more about people by watching how they treat someone who cannot offer them anything in return. The elderly guest thanked her softly. Vincent followed the exchange without speaking. Around them, several customers lowered their eyes, suddenly reflecting on their own behavior. The lounge manager, standing near the entrance, released a slow breath he had apparently been holding for several minutes. Vincent gave a faint smile, although this one carried less confidence than before. Interesting philosophy, he admitted. Does it always work? Naomi nodded gently. Not always immediately, but eventually character introduces itself. The sentence lingered over the room like the final note of a song. Even Vincent's associates shifted uneasily in their chairs. They had expected an argument, perhaps even embarrassment. Instead, every response from the young waitress seemed to redirect the conversation towards something larger than pride. Vincent found himself studying not only Naomi but the reactions surrounding her. Guests who had avoided eye contact earlier were now watching with quiet admiration. Employees who had seemed nervous only minutes before stood a little straighter. Nothing dramatic had happened. No voices had been raised. No threats had been exchanged. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way Vincent could not easily explain. For years he had believed authority came from making other people feel small. Tonight, without intending to challenge him, Naomi had begun proving that genuine respect could fill a room more completely than fear ever could. And somewhere behind Vincent's composed expression, a certainty he had carried for decades began to feel just a little less certain. The question lingered between them long after the music resumed. Vincent Moretti had spent years believing every conversation could be steered with pressure, every disagreement settled through presence alone. Yet Naomi Brooks continued answering him with something he rarely encountered: quiet certainty. It neither challenged him nor surrendered to him. It simply existed, steady as the city lights stretching beyond the windows into the Chicago night. One of Vincent's associates finally rose from his chair and walked toward the bar carrying the impatience that had slowly spread across the group. He looked at Naomi, then at Vincent, clearly expecting the conversation to end the way so many others had ended before. Instead, Vincent remained silent, almost studying the moment as though he were waiting for an invisible line to appear. The associate reached for the leather briefcase resting on the polished counter, but in his hurry his sleeve caught the edge of a decorative candle stand. The heavy glass centerpiece tilted toward a nearby elderly guest who had been quietly enjoying dessert alone. Several people gasped at once. Chairs shifted across the marble floor. Naomi reacted before anyone else finished standing. With one smooth movement, she stepped forward, guided the unstable centerpiece safely onto the counter, and gently moved the startled guest one step away from the edge of the table. The entire sequence lasted only a heartbeat. There was no panic, no dramatic display, only calm awareness followed by careful action. The candle never shattered. The guest remained unharmed. The restaurant returned to silence almost as quickly as it had erupted into concern. Naomi looked at the older gentleman with a reassuring smile. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. He nodded gratefully, adjusting his glasses with slightly trembling hands. "I am now," he answered. Several nearby diners quietly applauded, not because they had witnessed anything spectacular, but because they had witnessed kindness arriving faster than confusion. Vincent watched every second without speaking. His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with genuine curiosity. "That was quick," he finally said. Naomi simply replied, "My father always believed preparation is invisible until someone needs it." Vincent considered her answer while glancing at the untouched candle stand resting securely on the counter. "You have training," he observed. Naomi nodded once. "For many years." "Security?" he asked. "Discipline," she answered. The purpose was never to win fights. The purpose was to prevent people from getting hurt whenever possible. Her words settled over the room with unexpected weight. The guests who had quietly recorded earlier moments slowly lowered their phones. The bartender smiled almost imperceptibly before returning to his work. Even Vincent's associates seemed uncertain how to respond. They had expected intimidation to command attention. Instead, a simple act of awareness had quietly earned something far more valuable: respect. Vincent looked toward the skyline beyond the enormous windows, where reflections of countless office towers shimmered across the dark water of Lake Michigan. For the first time that evening, he appeared less interested in controlling the room than in understanding the woman standing before him. 15 years, he asked after a thoughtful pause. Naomi met his eyes calmly. "Yes, sir. And you never mentioned it." A gentle smile crossed her face. "Real discipline does not introduce itself. It waits until responsibility calls." No one answered after that. There was nothing left to interrupt. Somewhere deep inside the Harbor Crown Lounge, amid polished wood, soft jazz, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary conversations beginning again, Vincent realized he had spent decades measuring strength by the wrong standard. The strongest person in the room had never asked anyone to notice her. She had simply chosen, again and again, to protect dignity before pride, and that choice carried more weight than any reputation ever could. The Harbor Crown Lounge no longer felt like a place divided between important guests and invisible employees. Something subtle had changed, almost impossible to measure yet impossible to ignore. Conversations slowly returned, but their direction had shifted. Instead of watching Vincent Moretti for permission to relax, people found themselves watching Naomi Brooks with quiet respect. It was not because she had demanded attention. It was because she had never asked for it in the first place. The elderly gentleman she had helped finished his dessert, then stood carefully from his chair. Before leaving, he walked across the dining room carrying himself with the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing gratitude over pride. He extended his hand toward Naomi. "Young lady," he said warmly. "Thank you for seeing people who are easy to overlook." Naomi accepted the handshake with a gentle smile. "Everyone deserves to be seen, sir." Several nearby guests heard the exchange. A woman celebrating her anniversary quietly applauded. Her husband joined her. Within seconds, the applause spread to neighboring tables, not loud enough to interrupt the atmosphere of the restaurant, but sincere enough to fill the room with something that had been missing all evening. Appreciation. Naomi's cheeks flushed slightly. She gave a small nod, then returned to arranging glasses behind the bar as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, the evening was still about doing her job well. To everyone else, it had become something much larger. Vincent observed the reaction without saying a word. For years he had entered rooms where applause followed expensive speeches, successful investments, or carefully planned charity events. This felt completely different. No spotlight, no announcement, no public relations campaign. A waitress had earned genuine admiration simply by remaining true to herself. That realization unsettled him more than any argument could have. One of his associates leaned close and whispered, "We should probably head out." Vincent did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi as she helped another server carry a heavy tray to a nearby table. She thanked her co-worker for the assistance before quietly returning to her station. There was no sign that she considered herself the center of attention. She had already moved on. That simple humility challenged every assumption Vincent had built over the years. The lounge manager approached Naomi with visible relief. "You handled tonight with remarkable professionalism," he said softly. "I appreciate everything you did." Naomi smiled. "We all work together. That is what matters." The manager nodded, knowing she could easily have accepted all the credit but deliberately chose not to. Across the room, several employees who had spent years working long shifts under constant pressure exchanged encouraging smiles. They stood a little taller. They greeted arriving guests with renewed confidence. It was as though Naomi's quiet example had reminded them that professionalism was not weakness. It was strength expressed with patience. Vincent finally walked toward the entrance, but after only a few steps he stopped and looked back one last time. Naomi was helping a young busser learn the proper way to arrange silverware before the next reservation arrived. She explained each detail with calm encouragement, never making the nervous teenager feel embarrassed for asking questions. Vincent noticed something that had escaped him earlier. Influence did not always come from power. Sometimes it came from example. Sometimes the strongest person in the room was simply the one who helped others become stronger too. As the elevator doors closed behind Vincent and his group, the Harbor Crown Lounge felt lighter than it had all evening. The skyline still glittered beyond the windows. The jazz pianist continued playing as though the city itself had quietly exhaled. And inside that elegant room, where fear had once demanded everyone's attention, dignity had become the quiet voice that people remembered most. The next morning, Chicago woke beneath low gray clouds and a steady breeze rolling across Lake Michigan. But inside the Harbor Crown Lounge, conversations from the previous night had not disappeared with the closing shift. They had quietly multiplied. Employees arriving for the breakfast service had already heard different versions of the same story. Some remembered the calm waitress who had prevented an accident before anyone else reacted. Others talked about the wealthy guest who had unexpectedly found himself questioning his own assumptions. None of them exaggerated the events because they did not need to. The truth was compelling enough. Naomi Brooks arrived 10 minutes early, just as she always did. She tied her apron, greeted the kitchen staff by name, checked every table setting, and helped a new employee learn the reservation system before the doors officially opened. If anyone expected her to behave like the center of attention, they quickly realized they were mistaken. She worked with exactly the same quiet focus she had carried every day for years. Her manager watched from across the dining room with growing admiration. Character, he realized, was easiest to recognize after applause had already faded. Before the lunch crowd arrived, the elderly gentleman from the previous evening returned carrying a small envelope. He asked politely whether Naomi had a moment. She stepped away from the service station, expecting perhaps a forgotten receipt or a misplaced personal item. Instead, the gentleman handed her a handwritten note. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "Last night reminded me that kindness still exists, and I had almost forgotten what that looked like." Naomi unfolded the card after he left. Inside, only one sentence appeared in careful blue ink. "Never allow the world to convince you that quiet people cannot change it." She smiled softly before placing the note inside her locker beside an old photograph of her father standing in the neighborhood gym where everything had begun. Throughout the afternoon, several regular customers requested Naomi's section without knowing exactly why. They simply remembered how welcome she had made everyone feel. Tips became slightly larger. Conversations became warmer. Coworkers who had once hurried through exhausting shifts now paused to encourage one another, almost unconsciously following the example Naomi had demonstrated without ever announcing it. Meanwhile, across the city, Vincent Moretti found himself unable to concentrate on the meetings filling his schedule. Financial reports waited unopened on his desk. Advisors discussed investment opportunities while his attention drifted somewhere else entirely. He kept replaying the previous evening, not because anyone had challenged his authority, but because no one had needed to. For perhaps the first time in years, he had witnessed influence that required neither wealth nor reputation. Late that afternoon, one of his longtime associates finally asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. What made that waitress different? Vincent remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. "She was never trying to defeat anyone," he said quietly. "She was protecting something inside herself that money cannot buy." The room fell silent. No one laughed. No one argued. They had known Vincent for years, yet they had rarely heard him speak with such reflection. Outside his office window, the Chicago skyline stretched toward the horizon, built by generations who believed strength meant building something that outlived their own names. Vincent looked across the city and wondered whether he had spent too many years collecting influence while overlooking integrity. At that very moment, Naomi welcomed another family through the doors of the Harbor Crown Lounge with the same warm smile she offered every guest, completely unaware that the greatest lesson from the previous night had never been about proving her strength. It had been about reminding everyone else what real strength had looked like all along. 3 weeks passed, and life at the Harbor Crown Lounge settled into its familiar rhythm. Yet something lasting had quietly taken root beneath the polished floors and warm amber lights. New employees learned the story not as gossip, but as an example of the kind of professionalism the restaurant hoped every person would carry. Guests who returned often recognized Naomi Brooks before reading her name tag. They remembered the waitress who listened carefully, treated everyone with equal respect, and somehow made an elegant evening feel unexpectedly personal. Naomi never corrected anyone who praised her. She simply thanked them and continued serving the next table with the same steady smile. At home, Marcus Brooks noticed the change before she ever mentioned it. Over a simple dinner, he watched his daughter place a folded handwritten note beside his favorite coffee mug. He read the sentence slowly, smiled with quiet pride, and looked at her across the kitchen table. "You finally understand what I spent all those years trying to teach you," he said. Naomi laughed softly. "I thought I understood before." Marcus shook his head with gentle amusement. "Before, you knew the lessons. Now you have lived them." Those words stayed with her long after the evening ended. Across the city, Vincent Moretti found himself making small decisions that surprised even the people closest to him. Meetings became shorter and more respectful. Employees who offered honest disagreement discovered they were actually being heard instead of dismissed. Longtime associates noticed that he had begun asking questions before giving orders. The changes were not dramatic enough to become newspaper headlines, but those who worked beside him recognized that something fundamental had shifted. One afternoon, Vincent returned alone to the Harbor Crown Lounge without reservations, photographers, or an entourage. He chose a quiet table near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Naomi approached with the same professional warmth she offered every guest. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome back." Vincent smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no trace of performance in his expression. "Good afternoon, Naomi." He ordered a simple cup of black coffee and thanked her when she placed it on the table. Before leaving, he stood and handed her a small envelope. "This is not a reward," he said calmly. "It is a thank you." Naomi waited until he had gone before opening it. Inside was a donation receipt showing that a substantial contribution had been made to restore the neighborhood youth gym where Marcus Brooks had coached for decades before illness forced him to leave. There was no signature. Only one handwritten sentence appeared beneath the receipt. Real strength deserves another generation to learn from it. Tears briefly gathered in Naomi's eyes, but she quickly smiled instead. She understood that some victories were measured not by applause, but by the quiet decisions people made after nobody was watching. Months later, children once again filled the old gym with laughter, determination, and hope. Marcus returned as an honorary instructor, watching young students discover confidence through discipline rather than fear. Naomi continued working evening shifts at the Harbor Crown Lounge because she genuinely loved welcoming people from every walk of life. Some nights were busy, others were quiet. Every evening reminded her that dignity could be practiced in ordinary moments long before extraordinary ones arrived. The skyline beyond the restaurant windows continued to glow over Chicago, reflecting countless stories of ambition, success, failure, and redemption. Yet among them all, the lesson that endured was beautifully simple. Money may open doors. Reputation may fill a room. Fear may command silence for a little while. But respect earned through humility, discipline, and kindness has a way of echoing long after every other voice has faded.